Looks good. All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Q&A session. That's what I'm calling it, to just follow up from the webinar. I'm going to try and share myself here for a second so you can see me as well. There we go. Okay, so hi, it's John Okumbora from Excel Campus. Again, I'm just holding this session today as kind of a follow-up for the webinar that we did last week. I know not everyone got to attend that, some due to time schedules, and then others couldn't make it on the call because we maxed out the call. And so again, I apologize for that. That was not my intention at all. I didn't realize we would have so many people joining the call. So that was great. I'm so excited to see everyone wanting to learn VBA and learn macros and all this stuff. But it wasn't my intention to not allow you to get on there. So I apologize for that. But I just wanted to hold a follow-up call to answer any other questions you might have after you watch the replay, or that you have if you've started kind of diving into macros and VBA and you're starting to learn it and maybe you have some questions. So there's a chat box right there on the right side of the screen that you'll be able to type a question into. Now, I just want to let you know that with this Google Hangout that I'm about 10 seconds ahead of you, or it's a little bit delayed. So it might take a second for me to answer your question and see your question and that kind of stuff. So just know there's a little bit of delay there, but we'll try and do our best to answer questions. And of course, if you have any questions about the course as well, the VBA Pro Course, I'll be happy to answer questions as well. So I have a list of a few questions. I'll just pull those up here let me share my screen. Can't do two things at once. So I have a list of some questions that came in that came in at the end of the webinar, and I got to some of those, but I didn't get to all of them. So I'll go ahead and answer some of those questions as well. And then, of course, if you have any questions, you could just type in the chat right over there and ask any questions during this session as well. So let me go ahead and share my list here. And so a few questions that came in, I'll just go through some of these. I went through some of these this morning as well, but I'll just go over a few of these again, because there were some great questions. Sid was asking about if statements in VBA, and this is a really good question. Of course, yes, we can use if statements in VBA, and I'll show some examples of that. In fact, I have a workbook here that has some examples. Let me jump into the VBA editor here. Again, Alt F11 on the keyboard, or Developer tab, going into Visual Basic here. So this workbook, this is actually the workbook from Module 1 of the VBA Pro Course. This is one of the workbooks from Module 1 that has a lot of different code samples. You can see all these code modules over here on the left with all kinds of different code samples and macros in here. And then there's some example if statements right here in this particular code module with just simple macros that show different if statements. So if statements are an extremely powerful tool in VBA because it allows us to make decisions. And those decisions could be based on an action that the user takes, or it could be based on the value of a cell or some kind of action within or some kind of property within the workbook itself. So there's a lot of different ways you can use if statements, but they're extremely powerful because they help us kind of make decisions, say, hey, if this condition is met, let's do this. If this condition is not met, let's do something else. So this is a very simple example here. It's just saying if the row of the active cell equals 10, then it's going to display a message box that says the active cell is in row 10. So it's a very simple if statement. And if that condition is not met, if the active cell is not in row 10, active cell is the same as the selected cell. So if that cell is not in row 10, then it won't run anything. It'll just go to the end if line and then continue on in the macro. So that I won't go too deep into those unless you have more questions on that. But it's just kind of good to understand that you can use if statements. They're a very powerful tool, and we go in depth in that in the course as well. Okay, so another question, will VBA work in Office 2007, 2010, and 2013, and Office 365? Yes to all of those. Any Windows version of Excel, basically you can use VBA in. If you're using the Mac, you'll need Excel 2011. The new 2016 version doesn't. It has an editor there, but it's pretty much a blank slate or blank canvas, and there's not many buttons or anything that to interact with really in terms of controls. So yeah, you'll want to use the Windows versions or Excel 2011 for Mac. Margie's gonna enroll. I believe she already did actually, and got her company support. So if anyone else is thinking about enrolling, it's definitely worth asking your employer if they'll pay for the course or reimburse you. Is typically what happens. They reimburse you, but it's definitely worth asking because most employers are willing to invest in your education for sure. And then another question about there is a 3-team package or a 3-membership team package, and the price on that is $687. What are the differences between this workbook and the personal macro workbook? So this is a great question here, and I want to go into this one. I didn't answer this one this morning, so I'm going to go into this one as well because this is a great question. So this workbook versus your personal macro workbook, two kind of different things here. So let's jump into Excel and kind of understand what all this means. I'm going to shut down some of these. You notice when I shut these down, we get the windows kind of not minimized, but just resized here. Now I want to go into, well, we'll just go into this macro example one. So typically when you go into any file and you see it in the VB editor and you open the Excel objects folder, which contains all the sheet objects, and then it'll always have this workbook object as well. We see it right here. It says this workbook. If you double click on that, that'll just open this code module over here for this workbook. And typically with this workbook, we're going to put events in here. So we'll put events that will run when the user takes an action in Excel. So for example, if you select or click this drop down right here and then choose workbook, we're now you'll see this sub or this macro has been added for the workbook open event. So then when the user opens this particular workbook, again, we're in this macro examples workbook here in this workbook code module. When the user opens this workbook, if you have any code here, that code will run when the user opens the workbook. So, and you could put anything in there, any code or any macro, or it could call it another macro, but that'll automatically run when the user opens the workbook and enables the macros. They'll also have to take the step to enable the macros, and then that code will run. Now that might be useful, might not be useful to you, but there are a list of all the other events over here in this dropdown. So if you hit this dropdown, you first need to select workbook in this dropdown over here, and then you select this dropdown, and there's a bunch of different events in here, all kinds of different workbook level events. So probably one of the most popular ones are the sheet change events. You'll see sheet change right here. And this, I'll just go ahead and select it so you can see what happens. So this will put in this workbook sheet change event. And basically this will run any code when you make any kind of change to the sheet. So if you make a change to a cell value in the sheet or a selection or anything like that, this macro will run. It'll also tell you what cell has been selected, the target cell that's been modified. It returns that as well. It's called the target. So you can actually see, you can actually use that in your code to say, oh, hey, the user selected cell A5. I want to run this macro that does this particular thing. So, and then the other popular one is the sheet activate event. It's probably another popular one. Where is it here? Sheet activate. And this one, oops, I selected the wrong one. Sheet activate. Yeah, sheet activate. Let me get rid of some of these, and we'll do an example of sheet activate real quick. So sheet activate will run when the user selects a sheet. So for example, we could just put a message box here. This message box is just a function that will just display a message box, and we'll just say you have selected a sheet, something like that. Yay. And that'll just put a message box in, so we can just see how this works. So I'm going to minimize this, and I'll bring Excel up over here. We're in this workbook. Oh, I got a little weird there. Oh, got it. Sorry, I got two screens going. Gotta figure them all out here. So See if we can get that there, and then we can get the, there we go. This will kind of get us close. Okay, so let's go back to my this workbook event. So now if we were to, let's say we have this code here on the sheet activate, and if we were to change a sheet, just select a new sheet in this workbook, you can see we get this message box displayed that says you have selected a sheet. I didn't even spell it correctly, but you can see how that works. So this is an event, and whenever the user does something, it's going to fire that macro, whatever in that macro right there. Also returns the sheet name right there, sh as object. That'll return the sheet name of the sheet that they selected. So you could actually add that to this. If we just said and then sh.name, that would return the sheet name. So now when I select, say I select this sheet, it shows me that message and then says, you know, you've selected that, and then also returns the sheet name there as well. So you can do a lot with these events. So that is kind of a high level, quick dive into this workbook object and the events within this workbook. Now, each worksheet has events as well, too. I won't go into those in too much detail, but it basically works the same way. So if we went to this sheet 1 here and double click that, that would open the code module for sheet 1. And then we can see here, if we choose this drop down, we have worksheet events, and this would be a selection change. So if the user selects a cell in the sheet, and there's all types of different events here for the worksheet as well. Pivot table changes, things updating the pivot table, selection change, calculate, all kinds of worksheet events that would only be specific to this sheet 1 when we ran sheet 1. So that's this workbook. Okay, and oh yeah, I just wanted to make sure I'm not missing any questions here real quick. Sid, yes, thank you. Thank you. I just read your comment. Yeah, I know Sid joined the course this week, and thank you, Sid. I'm super excited you're here. David, can it name the specific sheet? Oh, yeah. Okay, so I got your answer there, I think, David, with the sheet name. And that's true of any of those, most of those events. So if we went back to this workbook, oh, I guess I deleted it already. If we went back to, did I delete that one? Yeah, I guess I did. Yeah, so that's true of all those different events. All those events have arguments there, or most of them have arguments. Activating the sheet, that's going to return the sheet name. That target in the sheet change event, target will actually return the range, the selected range. And you can get the sheet there returned as well. So you can do a lot with that, really make your macros smart. And that'll kind of get you thinking, you should start thinking creatively about how you can use these events to your advantage. Because you can use, and one you'll see on the internet if you start looking this stuff up, is the intersect method to check if the selected cell intersects this, or the target intersects whatever range you want to take an action on. So if if you have, say, like cell C5 or anything in column C, if the user selects anything in column C, then we want to run a macro. And you can compare the target range, which would be the range they actually select, to column C5 or range column C, and do that kind of stuff. Okay. And yes, David, it's all covered in the course. So these sheet change events are covered in the course on how to run macros as well. As you can see, they're not all covered because there's a ton of them, just like everything with VBA, but I covered that kind of the high level and the basics of those ones. Okay. So, and then the other part of that question, so I know I got off on a tangent in that question, but the other part of that question was, what's the difference between kind of this workbook and the personal macro workbook? So the personal macro workbook, I also have mine open here. This personal macro workbook would store all of your macros. So in this case here, I have a bunch of macros, or I'm sorry, a bunch of modules with different macros in them. This one just copies the file path to the clipboard. I actually use this one a lot when I'm recording videos. It changes the size of my Excel application to fit the video recorder screen. So just do certain things. And these would be macros that you could run anytime, because the personal macro workbook opens when you open Excel. So it opens in the background when you open Excel. So you have all your macros here. You can assign buttons to these up on the ribbon. You could create a toolbar up here in the ribbon and assign buttons to them as well, or run them with the keyboard shortcut. So there's different ways to do that. And I have a whole video series and blog post that covers that in more detail. But that's the basic difference. There are kind of two different things there. But this workbook will allow you to you'll mostly use that for workbook level events that are triggered when the user takes some action in the workbook. Okay, so David, great question. Is it possible to write a macro affecting the selected pivot table, not a named pivot table? Yeah, so you could use the intersect method for that as well. That would allow you to basically determine if the cell you have selected is inside a pivot table, and you can use that. There's a few different ways to do it. I'm probably going to mess up on which is the best way. I know I've wrote it in the past for PivotPal. My PivotPal add-in actually does that. It determines if the cell you have selected is in a pivot table when it opens the user form. And there's a few different ways to do that. I think you can loop through all the pivot tables on the sheet, or you can check if the parent of the cell is in a pivot table. So I'll follow up with that one, David. And get you an exact answer. But yes, to answer your question, it can definitely be done without having to name the pivot table or know what the name is inside the code. Oh, gotcha. Okay, so okay, so you want to change the formatting in the selected pivot table. If the user is in the selected pivot table, yes, absolutely, that can be done as well. So that's something that my PivotPal add-in does as well. So I'll show you here because I have some workbooks open. So in this case here, we can open PivotPal. Well, I'll show you how I normally open it. Would be from the Excel campus, PivotPal. Oh, opened over here. There we go. There's PivotPal. So this is a user form. It's all created in the VB editor. Nothing special here. Is all created in the VB editor. And so this opens, it knows that we're talking about this specific pivot table right here. And you can actually change the formatting right here of that selected, the values area, whatever field you have selected in the values area, you could change the formatting. So that's all happening with VBA based on the selected pivot table or the pivot table we have selected. And is no, that is not covered in the course in depth. I think that would be a good one for maybe like a VIP session or something. I've actually been thinking about doing a whole nother course just on VBA and pivot tables because it's such a vast topic that it could definitely take a lot of time and lessons. So it's not something that's specifically covered in the course, but we could definitely cover it in a VIP session. I do have another VIP session that I talked about pivot tables and did an overview of how to work with pivot tables in VBA. And that recording of that session is in the course. And there's a file you can download and follow along with it as well. So it gives you an overview of how to work with pivot tables in VBA and how you use objects and properties. It's a massive library. If you start using the macro recorder and making changes to your pivot tables, it's a massive library. You can also get all the code for PivotPal. I have a developer version as well for PivotPal, and that just unlocks all the code, so you can go in and I might even have it open here. I might have the I have the developer version. So you can actually get this particular version and then go in and look at the PivotPal form here and look at all the code behind it. Hit F7 to jump to the code behind it and look at how it all runs and everything like that. So it's probably a good way to get a lot of this code for pivot tables as well, because there's a lot there. Okay, so let me move on to some of these other questions. Of course, if you have any questions at any time, you can type them in the chat over there. Last day for the offer, Nicola, is this Thursday. I extended it 2 days, so it's this Thursday as well. I'll also let me put the link up. I have a link that you can see in the chat over there for the course as well. So I'll put that up and it shows the last day of the offer there as well. Yeah, we kind of already covered that one. Definitely ask your employers. What happens or what's the benefits of saving a macro in the personal macro workbook? Another good question here. Like I said before, it's that you can always open or that workbook's always open, and you can access it at any time. You can access those macros at any time. So that's another great question. These two questions are also really good. I kind of covered them this morning, but it's good to know. Basically, AP wants to know if when you change the name of the sheet in the workbook, will that automatically update the sheet name in VBA? Or a reference, basically, I think what he's talking about is a reference to the sheet name. And the answer to that is no. So it's a really good question, though, because it's kind of makes you think about how to program some of your macros. And I have one here where we talked about, oh, maybe I didn't open it. Let me just open it real quick. There we go. There we go. Oops, I did that again. So we talked about this one here. So we wrote this macro in the webinar, which would be, we have this reference for worksheets, sheet 2. If we were to go change this sheet name in Excel to sheet 3 or something more descriptive, this will not change in VBA. This reference will not change. There's no direct link there when we're referencing sheet names like this or ranges like this. There's no direct reference. So if we were to insert a column, this would not become B3 instead of A3 in VBA. There's no link there, which is good, which can be good and could be bad, right? Because you might not want your references to change, and you might want them to change when the user makes a change in the sheet. So a few ways around that. One, you can use named ranges. If for sheets, I'm sorry, for ranges, you could use named ranges instead of A3, because that named range will move the reference, and all you're doing is referencing the name in here. So if you had a name like data or sales range or something, that which is a named range, then you could reference it in your code just like that. And that way, when the user inserts a row or a column or something, that range hopefully won't change. The other thing you can do with ranges is use tables, Excel tables, which are called list objects in VBA. And those are another great tool because they're kind of self-contained spreadsheets within a spreadsheet. And it's much easier to reference those. You can reference them as list objects, or you can actually reference them as a range. So if your range was, or if your table is named table 1, it would reference something like that. And you could reference the column as well. Something like this would actually select, or whatever you want to do to the range. If you just want to select that particular column, you could do that. And that would select column 1 in your table. So that's another way to do that. Now, when we're talking about worksheets, with worksheets, you can, if you knew that the user could potentially change this name from sheet 2, you can use the code name for the sheet. And the code name for the sheet is right over here. So you'll see, again, I'm in this workbook here, my first macro, and here's the sheet objects. We can actually reference the code name. Now, right now, they're named the same. So if I was to go to this workbook here, my first macro, let's just change it so it's not called sheet 2 anymore. Let's call it data, and I'll hit enter, and then we'll jump back to the VB editor. So you can see now sheet 2, it's called sheet 2 here, and then in the parentheses, it says data. So this is the sheet name that we see in the workbook. This is the code name here for the sheet. So there's two different naming conventions for the sheet, actually. And this one will not change or cannot be changed by the user. It can be changed here in the properties window. So there's properties window down here. I have sheet 2 selected. You can go change the name right here if you'd like, but it will not, the user cannot change that name. So if you wanted to make sure that even though they change the name, you're still talking about sheet 2, you can use this reference and you can use it in your code. So if I just type right here, sheet 2, and then hit a dot, you'll see I get all the properties and methods for the worksheet object, in this case, sheet 2. So this is a great way to reference sheets. It has some limitations of its own because it's specific to this workbook. You couldn't necessarily copy this code to another workbook now unless the sheet name in that sheet was also named sheet 2. So there might be some, and I'm talking about the code name, not the actual sheet name, but the code name itself. Again, that's the code name there. So there's some limitations there, but it's a great way to reference sheets if you know that you want to reference sheet 2, and no matter what the name of it is, you just reference that code name and nothing will change with your code. So hopefully that makes sense. That's a great question though, just kind of about referencing objects and how there's really not always a link between VBA and Excel. Okay, Jen has a question. Can you reference those macros in personal macro workbook in workbook shared with other users? So that's a good question, Jen. You can, if you're going to want to have that workbook contain the macros. So if you're sharing a workbook with someone else, you're going to want to keep the macros in that workbook. So in this case here, we're in this My First Macro. It's not my personal macro workbook, but this workbook does contain macros. So I could email this to you, or I could share this workbook with you, and you'd be able to run the macros inside of it. My personal macro workbook is actually stored on my computer. So we can't necessarily share that. I mean, you could share that with others. You could go find where it's located on your computer and send that to someone else. But they wouldn't necessarily want to run that if they have their own personal macro workbook. They might not want to open it, or it might cause conflict if they open 2 at the same time. So you want to store your macros in a workbook like this with the .xlsm extension, a macro-enabled workbook, and then you can send that to other people and they can run your macros. So I hope that helps answer your question. If not, just let me know and I'll be happy to follow up with that one. Okay, so let's see. So we covered those 2. Those were, I think, really good questions, and kind of starting with the concepts of VBA and Excel and kind of learning how they talk to each other. Okay, great, Jen. Okay, so this one here, do the worksheet changes affect the macro every week? This Brittany has probably adding some rows to her data set and kind of wants to know how that would work with the macro. And there's different ways to, basically one task we do a lot is just trying to find the last row, the last used row of data. Like here we have data. So maybe in Brittany's workbook, next week or next month, whatever it is, she comes in here and then has to, oops, I hit the wrong button there, just to paste data down here to the bottom and wants to know how to find row 372 to paste the data with her macro. So there's a few different ways to do that. I actually have a video series on how to find the last row in 3 different ways to accomplish this, depending on what your data looks like. I typically use the range.find method. And it's the ugliest and scariest method of all of them. I think in this module 1, there might actually be the code in here for that guy in my personal macro workbook. Yeah, so I know it's here. So I have this, and you could download this file on that blog post, but basically there's the range.find method, which is this ugly looking thing here with all these arguments in it. You've probably seen this on the web, but this is actually the same method as the find menu in Excel. So if you hit Control F in Excel, if we jump back to Excel and hit Control F, that method is basically this with all these options of where to look, worksheet or workbook, which row by rows or columns, case sensitive. All these options here are options in VBA with the range.find method, which is this find method here and all these arguments. So it's a really powerful tool because it allows us to look or search through and find, in this case, find the last used row. We're basically looking for something that any cell that contains anything in it. That's what this asterisk is. It's just this wildcard character. So it allows us to go find the last row or find the last column. Another way to get around that as well is to use tables. That makes it a lot easier. Excel tables. Again, this is a table right here. It's a self-contained. If you're not familiar with using tables, it's definitely one thing to learn. I cover these in the course in module 11, which is the bonus module on spreadsheet applications. I cover tables in depth in the beginning of that module because they're great tool to use when you're programming VBA. Because like I said earlier, they're kind of the self-contained sheet within a sheet. And it just makes it really easy to reference these with the list objects object. It's called list objects in VBA, and I cover all that in the course and go into how to reference them and how to loop through them or find the last row. You just reference the columns, resize them, add data to them, all those kinds of actions that we normally take with data. It becomes a lot easier with tables because they're all kind of just nicely in this nice box for us. We don't have to go worry about trying to use other methods to find what our data looks like. And of course, they have filters built in too, so you can take all actions with filters in VBA as well, and it's all kind of built in there. So tables are great. A lot of people don't like to use them because the structured reference formulas are ugly or kind of different than normal referencing, and it's totally true, valid point, but they can really help you when you're designing applications with VBA especially. Okay, so covered that guy. Diane had a question about bank reconciliations. I don't have a template for that, but you can use pivot tables for reconciliations. I do have an article on that as well, or you could use VBA. Potentially you could use Power Query. There's a lot of different ways to do bank reconciliations. It's a really great question though. Maybe I'll do a post on that in the future along with the pivot table. Fazalou, that's a cool name. Sorry if I pronounced it wrong. How long does it take to complete the course? That's a great question. This will really depend on how fast you go or how much time you take, which I would recommend taking your time with the course and not trying to power through it, because VBA takes time to learn and it's best if you practice. So if you watch a video, 1 or 2 videos a day and really practice that material, you could probably get through it in 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks. But that would require a lot of commitment of time. I think what most people do is if they're just starting out with VBA, they go through the first few modules, probably the first 4 or 5 modules, and really get an understanding of the basics and practice that, and then come back as they start getting better and want to learn user forms and those kinds of controls as well. So a lot's going to depend on how much time you commit to the course, but I say take your time with it and practice as much as you can with VBA. Just like Excel, you could take a course and blow through it and, maybe pick up some tips and tricks, but to really understand it, you definitely got to practice it and practice it with your own projects too. So that's the best advice I could give on that one. And there's no set deadline or pace. I know Kurt already enrolled in the course, and there's no set deadline or pace. You can go at your own pace. You get lifetime access, so you can come back in the future and pick up right where you left off and go at your own pace. And I recommend doing that because everyone learns at a different pace, and that's what makes online learning so great, as you go at your own pace as time permits, right? We all have limited time. Freda had a great question about the object model, and I showed this one this morning, but it's worth showing because I'll jump into VBA. I'm hitting Alt F11 there. So the object model, as we've seen, is massive, right? Every time we type one of these references and hit a dot, you see this long list of, if you type cells here and hit a dot, you see this long list of properties and methods. How in the heck could you remember all this, right? There's a ton of them for every single object in Excel, especially things like pivot tables. It's just massive. So there is an object browser. If you go to this toolbar up here, or you hit F2 on the keyboard, that'll get you to the object browser, and that opens up this window here. And the first thing is there's a list of all the libraries that we currently have referenced. And this one is the Excel library, so we can drill into that. And then you can actually search for objects or properties here, or you could scroll through the classes here and see all these different objects. And then if you select one, axis of a chart, you can see just the axis of a chart has all these properties of course, they just go along with the axes of a chart. There's a ton of them. There's no way to remember all this stuff. So this is one way to kind of navigate through it. And then you can also get the help here for that particular property. So that's one way to kind of navigate. I rarely use this, honestly, this object library, because it just kind of, to me, it's a little difficult to navigate through, and it doesn't always give you that much information. So I think it's pretty old and outdated, to be completely honest. One other thing you can do, though, and just close it here, is if you're ever in, if you just type in a macro here, you can always select. So if, let's say we wanted to know information about the find method here, if I just put my mouse cursor anywhere there, you can see it's flashing there, and then hit F1 on the keyboard, that'll bring up the help let me pull it over here. That'll bring up the help page on the MSDN site for the range.find method. So I just hit F1 on the keyboard with my mouse cursor in there, and that brings up this page on MSDN. And then you can see here that, especially with something like range.find, there's a ton of parameters here for this. They're all listed here to tell you what they do, what VBA is expecting you to put in there for that parameter. And then down at the bottom, there's typically some examples as well that you can kind of go through and see how this works. Some of these examples are great. Some of them are kind of a little hard to understand how to apply that, but it'll at least get you started with learning some of these properties and methods. And so this help site is great. And you can see over here on the left as well, we have the range object, and then the methods, and then all the methods for the range object are listed over here. So again, there's no way you can remember all these. You just kind of, as you go, and as you're, whatever needs you have for a specific project, you'll really start accumulating these and learning these as you go. So don't let it overwhelm you at first. It easily can. I mean, it's just like looking at all the functions in Excel. I don't use that many functions compared to how many there are. I sometimes surprise myself with what I do know, but I still don't know a lot of the functions in Excel, and I probably never will, because I don't have a need for all of them, right? And that's the same with this. As you go and as you start to understand what your needs are, you'll learn some of these. So in the course, of course, I don't cover all these, and there's a reason for that. I only cover the ones that I think you'll probably need, and then really getting the understanding of how to learn where these are at and how you can find more of them and solve your problems is really a big part of learning VBA as well. All right, so hopefully that helps, that MSDN site. I do use that quite a bit just to kind of understand and learn some of the properties and methods. But it's a huge problem for everyone, so don't feel overwhelmed with trying to understand it all at one time. Again, you'll do that as you research stuff and just learn as you go. I do cover a bit in the course programs, the other Office applications. I have a VIP session where I covered that, how to interact with the other Office applications like Outlook and Word and PowerPoint and even Access, and the difference between early binding and late binding. So I don't go in too much detail in that in the course, but it is covered a bit there. Jesse had a question about when would you need to select a range in VBA, and that's a good question. I think that's, again, one of those where you don't need to do it as much as you think. As I showed in the webinar, you don't always need to use .select to select a range before you copy and paste it or something like that. Really, selecting a range might be for the benefit of the user. So if you want a certain range selected so the user can navigate somewhere very quickly, then that's a good time to use that select method. Otherwise, you don't necessarily have to select ranges prior to modifying the properties of them or changing the value or adding a formula or things like that. Lisa wanted to know, if you're not a whiz with formulas and functions, can you still learn VBA? Of course you can. You don't need to know all the formulas and functions and be an expert in those before learning VBA. I think you can kind of definitely learn both at the same time and learn different ways to solve problems. This is another good question. I covered it this morning in detail, but if anyone wants me to go over it again, I definitely will. Mark wanted to know how the for each or the for next loop moved down one row when I had this macro here, and I'll just show it real quick. I'll just show it real quick here. That one, this loop right here. So Mark wanted to know how this, when we ran this macro in the webinar, this is the one that listed all the sheets in the workbook, this macro here. He was wanting to know how this moved down one row each time in the loop. And that is because the active cell has properties. So if I type active cell here and then open the parentheses, you'll see there's two parameters, not properties. Active cell. Now, active cell is the same as the cell we currently have selected. That's what the active cell reference is. And then there's, if you open the parentheses on it, there's a row index and a column index. So this would just offset a number of rows or columns from the active cell. So, and that we can use here because this ws.index returns the number of the sheet in the workbook and then just went down a certain number of rows. So that's how we did that there. So if we were to type active cell and then we put a 1 in here, that would basically select the active cell. If we put a 2, that would go down one cell from the active cell, or I'm sorry, one row from the active cell and select that cell below. So that's how active cell works. It has those properties there, which is great. Another way you can do that is through the offset property as well. So if you just said range A5 here and then dot offset, offset is another property, and it also has similar row and column offsets. So if you're starting in a row and you want to go over a certain number of rows, or down a certain number of rows, or over a certain number of columns to the right or to the left, you can use the row offset. You can put negative numbers in there as well to offset a certain number of rows or columns. So that's a few different ways to kind of move or navigate from a specific cell's offset property there. Okay, so I hope that kind of answers that one. And let me just make sure we got all of our questions. Yeah. Developer tab. And then I'll talk about Power Query as well. Another great question. So to enable the developer tab, you just right click anywhere up here on the ribbon and then choose customize the ribbon. And then we're going to go to this Excel options, customize the ribbon, and we want to select the developer tab right here. So just check that box and hit OK. You can also customize the ribbon here as well. Of course, you could remove or uncheck these and remove some of the default ribbons, or you can add your own, like I have a My Macros custom toolbar. It's not enabled now. You can add your own buttons there and own groups and all kinds of stuff like that. So, but developer, check the box and hit OK. And that'll put it there. And then you can go to the macro or the Visual Basic Editor, Alt F11 on the keyboard. So let me just the Power Query was another great question that came in. Terry wanted to know if we can use macros with Power Query. And yes, if you're starting to use Power Query, it's a great tool. And it's in Excel 2016, they've actually added some references to the object model for Power Query. So, and Power Query moved to the data tab on the ribbon. So it's now here in the Get and Transform section on the data tab of the ribbon in Excel 2016. And it's actually built into Excel. It's no longer an add-in. So that means that we can use VBA with it. And there's a new set of references in the object model for Power Query. There's a few references online. I haven't seen too many so far, but there's a few references out there on how to use Power Query with VBA. Now, if you're using Excel 2010 or 2013, then you can only, you can't really do much with Power Query except to refresh the queries in the workbook. Since it's still an add-in, if you run the refresh all method, then it will refresh all the queries in the workbook, all the Power Query queries, and refresh those. So you can do that, which can get you a long ways with the click of a button. You can do that, and then maybe I have some reports where I do that and then update some pivot tables and make changes to pivot tables to select the most recent date and apply some filters and do some other stuff as well, some other manipulations that you can't necessarily do with Power Query. So you can use it in Excel 2010 and 2013 for that. And now it's getting better in Excel 2016 as far as what you could do with it with VBA, which is great because I don't know, Power Query is an awesome tool. And it also has a little ways to go with being user friendly, I should say, with writing the M code and the functions and all that. So yeah, it's a great tool. So yeah. Oh, Sid had a question about the recordings. Yes, I will be recording both of these sessions, and you should be able to watch them both. I'll send out a link with the recordings to both sessions tomorrow as well, Sid, in case you didn't register for the first session or second session. For any of those of you out there that did or didn't, I will send out links to both recordings. They'll be on YouTube as well. So if there's no other questions, I'll go ahead and wrap it up. Again, I'll also, if you had any questions about the course or anything like that, you can let me know. I'll put the offer up here as well for the special webinar only special, which includes a bonus module, and then the VIP package, which is 3 live Q&A calls with me. They'll be similar to this, interactive calls where I'll prepare more examples based on questions you have that you can submit ahead of time, and then I'll answer those questions and come up with example files and all that kind of stuff as well. So we'll go into that in more detail in those VIP sessions. So yeah, and of course, just shoot me an email if you have any other questions, either about the course or just learning VBA. I'm always happy to help answer questions when I can. So thanks again for joining me today, everybody, on short notice, and I appreciate you being here. So I hope you have a great week, and I'll talk to you soon. All right, bye.